I love that.
I'm really...
No, that's all I have to say. I love that.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Snark Squad Pod, the media podcast where sometimes we have to pull you back into the shallow end. My name is Money Nis.
I'm Nicole Sweeney.
And today we are joined by friend of the pod and fellow Snark lady, Sam. Sam, reintroduce yourself to everyone.
Hey guys, I am sorry for making you read this book. I am also
Above all, you are
that's all I am today. I am Sam, aka Democracy Diva, and I am gonna see if I still have friends after this episode.
Today, if you haven't guessed already, we are talking about A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin, and this is the third book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. It is a mammoth book. It is nearing 1,200 pages, I would like to say, and I'm telling you this for context to why Sam thinks we're no longer her friends, but also so you can appreciate what is happening when I turn it back to Sam and ask her for today's plot synopsis.
Okay.
Sam?
I looked for a summary online that was less than 2 pages long and then tried to write my own and still couldn't get there. And then I thought about doing like a Billy Joel We Didn't Start the Fire, but of what happened in this book. But that sounded really difficult and honestly like it would take even longer. So let's just see what happens. Okay. Jaime Lannister is free, running around the Riverlands with Brienne, who is trying to get him to King's Landing to be exchanged for Arya and Sansa, because Catelyn set him free under those circumstances. They get captured and taken to Harrenhal. Jaime loses a hand. They take a bath and talk about how it was great. The bath is important, guys. And we learn it was actually probably a good thing that Jaime killed King Aerys, which fair. And then he leaves Harrenhal, comes back after a weird trippy dream because he's sleeping on a weirwood stump, and that gives you weird trippy dreams. And he goes and rescues Brienne from the bear pit, which is great. Robb isn't mad at his mom for setting Jaime free because, whoops, he broke the vow he made to the Freys to seal their alliance and instead married some random Lannister bannerman's daughter, who is like totally a setup by the Lannisters because it's like, oh, he just happened to accidentally fall into her bed and she comforted him, at, you know, quote unquote. And so now they're married, obviously, because Robb doesn't make good decisions. What else? Balon Greyjoy falls off a bridge and dies, and that's important. This is tough, guys. So there's stuff going on in the Iron Islands. The new marriage alliance after Robb breaks his vow is that Edmure, Cat's brother, is going to marry one of the Frey girls. That turns out awesome. Arya's going on a road trip with an outlaw band called the Brotherhood Without Banners. She gets kidnapped by the Hound. She reaches the twins basically exactly when everybody dies. She eventually gets her sword back, abandons the Hound while he's dying, and gets on a boat to Braavos. Let's see what else happens here. Mm-hmm. Davos gets imprisoned. Davos becomes Stannis' Hand of the King. Davos lets King Robert's bastard escape, and while learning to read, finds a really handy letter from the Night's Watch being like, please come save us. Everything is fucked up here. And he does that, and that is also a good thing. In King's Landing, Joffrey sets aside Sansa to marry Marjorie Tyrell. The Lannisters sneak marry Sansa to Tyrion, and then Marjorie and Joffrey get married, which also ends spectacularly, as we all know. Sansa, after Joffrey dies, gets smuggled out of the castle by Dantos, and then Littlefinger finds out that it was Littlefinger and Olenna Tyrell who planned the Purple Wedding, which was Joffrey's death. Oberyn Martell is a thing and tries to kill Sir Gregor for Tyrion's trial. Guys, there's so much in this book. There's a trial by battle because they think Tyrion killed Joffrey, which he did not. Oberyn dies. Sir Gregor almost dies. Tyrion reacts by murdering his father and his lover and running away. And then Littlefinger pushes Lysa out the moon door, and then Lady Catelyn rises from the dead, and that's what happens in this book.
Also, the Winterfell, Theon and the Stark boys. Some shit happened up north.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yes. Yes.
North of the wall. Boo.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Like a lot more important stuff happened. And that was still 4 hours too long. So yes, add add craziness up north with the wildlings and Jon being a wildling and then not being a wildling and then saving the wall. Guys, I did a terrible job here, but I tried. It's so
No, you're killing it. There's just so
there's
much.
so much.
I think I kind of want to start talking about this here because, I mean, not that we haven't started every episode complaining about how much there is, but but I want to hear a little bit about your experience reading Nicole and just as we move along the series, like the entire idea of like the length and the details and everything that goes into this and how I think it makes sense to kind of touch base with that. So, Nicole, how'd it go?
Yeah, so I have been reading these books both on audiobook, having them read to me by the audiobook narrator who's super rad. I love him.
Roy Dotrice is amazing.
I did not enjoy, I have my first complaint, I did not enjoy his Missandei voice.
Me neither.
I was like, what the hell,
my
dude?
God. It's
Missandei deserves better than this voice.
Roy Dotrice is a god to me, and he makes like 3 critical errors in the whole book, and the most critical error is Missandei's very weird and vaguely offensive voice.
Okay. All right, I'm glad we all agree. But so I'm doing that, but then I also I bought like the 5 book set for like $20 on Kindle. Also, because there is so much, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is a way that I can, when it gets close, like just listen at 3 times speed. So I'm like reading it and having it read to me, whatever. So that experience, when you said the number of pages, I was like mildly surprised, only in that it like hadn't even occurred to me what the number of pages would be. To me, I know it as 47 hours and 32 minutes. Okay. Okay. That's the length of this that I want to put out there into the world. My experience with the length of it is that it is a lot. Clearly, it's a lot. And I come away from this, I think I mentioned this last time, but it stands out to me here too, that I have a bit of a like respect that I didn't have before for the show in the ways in which it was able to make some like good decisions about where to trim things down. I definitely think the show has made a lot of bad choices and like I complain about them all the time, but reading this now, like and seeing just how dense it is, honestly feeling like it in some places doesn't need to be as dense as it is. Like I'm just like there are pieces of it that I'm like, this really isn't that necessary. And I want us to move along. And it doesn't help that one of George R.R. Martin's like I think faults as a writer is that he is legitimately quite repetitive. There are just a number of like basic, the one that we've joked about repeatedly is like Jon mussing up Arya's hair, like take a shot every time he says it. Like that kind of like they didn't even fucking bend together in like 3,000 pages and you're still using this same throwaway descriptor. And there are a number of them like that just like really add to the sense that it is not only incredibly dense, but like there are places where it is needlessly dense. There are places where it does not actually need to be as dense as it is. And I don't know. I'm not going to say that it leaves me feeling like I actively dislike it, but it's a lot. It's just a lot. And I think that it is tricky to digest it quickly. I mean, we deliberately were like, okay, we're just going to do these episodes every other month, but like this isn't all I'm doing for 2 months in the way of media consumption, And I guess maybe if like this were the only thing I were doing for 2 months, I could like really sit with it and maybe I would have a different experience of it, but that would probably be worse because then this is like all I would be consuming. And there are a couple times where I'm like, I need to take a break from this. I need to not be in this world and in this space. So that's my like long rambly feelings on how long and rambly I feel this book is.
I think I'm with you in most regards. So I think primarily my issue is that I wish I weren't reading it like this. I'm really enjoying reading with you guys, and I think these episodes are some of my favorite because I love our discussions, but it's just the time clock on reading this is not how these stories I think are meant to be read. I think you need to really take your time and read like in the pace that you feel comfortable in, and take those breaks from the world when you need to, and all of that jazz. And because this isn't the only thing that we're doing, I have been leaving them to like the last minute and just reading like mad, like at the end, to try and get them in on time. And I think that's a disservice to the story. So I especially this time around, I was feeling like, man, I really wish I had more time to just like digest this at my own pace. And the other thing is that the more and more I consume these, the more and more I realize that while I'm kind of meandering with the story as I'm reading it, I really, really love them in retrospect. It's really weird. So as I'm reading it, I'm like, I don't want to read this. And then after it's done, I was like, that was great. And I think about like all of the little details, and I want to discuss them. And I was even at one point thinking about going back and rereading, because as you learn more, you just get that feeling that going back and rereading, you would get so much more out of what you already read.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe next year I'll like read through all of them so I'm already thinking about rereading, even though like 10 hours ago I was like banging my head against the wall. Like, I don't want to read this right now. So I don't know what it is about this material that it just really is better. And it gets better and better in my feelings the more that I think about it and the more that I sit with it. So even though I'm having some struggles getting through the material, both because, again, it's dense, it's dark, and it's heavy, but also because we're like on this go schedule, I'm not enjoying these books. They're really great, and I'm really enjoying all of the characters. And even when I'm kind of sad about revisiting some parts of it, it's making me excited for where we're going as well.
Yeah, I'm so relieved to hear you say that about being like, oh, I'm already thinking about rereading, even while I'm like suffering through this giant task. Because like that is how I feel and why I wanted to do this in the first place, which a little bit makes me feel guilty because like I'm making you guys do the actual hard work, which is reading this for the first time. Whereas I get to like kick back and read on my like 8 billionth time and just be like, ha ha ha, foreshadowing. Whereas like you guys are like actually killing yourselves to finish these in a 2-month time period. So the reason it's such an enriching experience for me, is because I've read it a zillion times already. And it is, obviously something that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper the more you read it, which it does that to a level that nothing else I've ever read does. So while it might not be better writing or, better stories or less problematic than some of my other favorite works, like there's no other series that I get more out of on reread and more on each successive reread than I do this series. And that's why I love it and why I appreciate you guys putting up with me.
To be fair, you didn't pick this time frame. Like we were like, every other month will be great. Like
that is true. And maybe we were a little bit ambitious, but I will say I always like agree that the books are too long because like that's a fact, but this is the first one where I felt like, I can make some edits here and there. I think everybody's plot that involves wandering around the Riverlands, I think could be 1 chapter shorter because there's a lot of those. And they all kind of get swirled around in your head together anyway. So you're like, wait, who, what, where, which guy is this? Which is most of my reaction.
Okay, wait.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to have a which guy is this? This is like kind of embarrassing. I had this moment of recognition and realization while reading this. So there are a lot of names, and like watching the show as we have, like it was when we were recapping the show, it was always just like a joke that like we were giving these people other names and like whatever. And it got to a point where I mostly, I probably knew more people's names than like the average viewer. I remember when Beric Dondarrion is introduced in the first book and like Jane and Sansa have that conversation about how dreamy he is, but he's old because he's 22. That's like seared into my brain.
Obviously.
I remember this, but it was not until when Arya first starts, hears about him in him and the Brotherhood Without Banners, that was the first moment that I like connected those two human beings realized that was one person.
Oh, including having watched the show?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes. Like Kingsguard Knight is like I had no I don't know. He like shows up and he's like with the priest of the Lord of Light, and he dies a bunch and gets revived. Like the fact that he had been in King's Landing at all, just like.
I will say the show makes it harder by changing the guy who plays Beric Dondarrion in between season 1 and when he comes back. So it is it's literally impossible to know that that's the same guy.
Okay.
So you are not completely insane. But
even when his name was brought up in the books, though, it didn't even occur to me. Like I didn't.
Right.
My head didn't go to that character.
Right.
Like on the show.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I was like, okay, yeah, this is like another Kingsguardsmith. I recognized the name. Like I knew. I was like, yeah, this is a name I know for sure, but like there's so many fucking people on this show.
There's a lot of goddamn names.
There's so many people. They all have weird names. I don't know, man. I don't know who you are. And then like I like that moment of like, I don't know. I just like had this big moment of like, oh, he's that guy. So anyway.
As you were saying something about like, oh, connecting characters, and I'm sitting here thinking, I hope she says Beric Dondarrion. I hope she says
I will say that the first 2 to 3 times that I read the 4th and 5th books, I had no idea whose chapter I was in. Like, I had, like, so much more embarrassing than just, like, oh, that's the same guy, that Beric Dondarrion. Like, I literally have chapters that I was like, oh, this is a completely different person than whose brain I thought we were inside. So, like, this is a judgment-free zone.
Nicole, you mentioned the show again, and I swear we're going to talk about the books, but as long as we're talking a little bit about like the adaptation side of it, I wish I had written down some more of these notes, but there were multiple times that I was thinking to myself like, oh, did we know this in the show, or am I just finding out because it's the book, or have I forgotten because it's so long ago? So there were little details like that, but I think the thing that struck me the most was that, and I don't even know if this is true, but just kind of the fuzziness of how long ago this all happened in the show, but just expecting the book to follow the format that the show did in terms of like when the Red Wedding happened, for instance. I was like, how much more book do we have?
Yeah.
Like, you're just expecting like those high notes and the season to end and that's it. And there was, I don't know, a lot that happened here that I wasn't even sure happened all in the same season.
It did.
This is 2 seasons.
It's kind of a little more than 2 seasons, but it's definitely, so they split it in half basically and did season 3 as like up till, a little after the Red Wedding. And then season 4 was when they had Joffrey die and Tyrion's trial and all that stuff.
So if you're looking at it in terms of this book has so many like very big moments.
It has all the big moments. Literally all the big moments. And that's why it's so ridiculous, because every time I read this book, I get to the Red Wedding and I'm like, there's like 20 big moments still left in this goddamn book. And I swear I have that same, you said there's so much more book after the Red Wedding. You can't believe it because you've just read everything up to that. But yeah, I hear that completely.
I'm curious if, since we were just talking about it, if reading the Red Wedding, how that went for you, if there was anything that you read in that scene that maybe you didn't capture the first time you read it, Sam, or because of the TV show, Nicole, or if it was any easier to get through that for the second time.
The Red Wedding was definitely a thing that made the like expansiveness of this book harder in a lot of ways. There were, honestly, we mentioned last time that like every time a Theon chapter came, I was immediately annoyed. Like the number of people whose heads I did not want to be in this book was like, it grew. And even Catelyn, I don't want to say that I actively didn't want to be in her head, but being in her head was just painful. Yeah. Knowing what was coming, it was just like, and, like not terrible in the way that Theon chapters were, or even in the way that Jaime chapters were in this book, which is somewhat similar to the way that Theon chapters were terrible in the last book. I'm sorry, I'm still not. I'm not brought back around.
I'll never be over it. It's
He's
fine.
Complicated, whatever. But like he spent most of this book thinking terrible things about Brienne, and then like occasionally he's like, yeah, I'll do you a solid, and then we're supposed to find him redeemed or something. I don't know. Fuck Jaime Lannister. But your question was the Red Wedding, and it made it harder than knowing it was coming. But like the reading it itself was not the show. That was worse. Seeing it was way, way worse than reading it.
Yeah, I think for me, what changed was what you already mentioned. It was being in Kat's head in that moment. It was different. I agree that there was something like a visual gut punch of that moment, especially because HBO and their blood budget and how gory that entire thing was. And Rob's wife was actually there, and like the baby and all of that. Like it was just really, really bad. But I think that being in Kat's head for that moment really struck me in a way that I wasn't expecting, because like you said, of course, like I didn't want to be in Kat's head in book 1, loved her book 2, and then book 3, like it just built me to this point where it was like, yeah, loved her, did you? And just, I think it was like kind of that final line where she's like, oh, they're coming towards her with a knife, and she's like, don't cut my hair, Ned loves my hair. And I was just like, sucker punch.
Yeah, that one, like I literally got chills just with you saying that. So like clearly that line still kills me. Me, you know, I feel like I can practically recite the Red Wedding chapter like by this point, like the drums were pounding in her head. So like I don't know that I've gotten new stuff out of that chapter on the last few rereads, but I have gotten so much more foreshadowing for the Red Wedding earlier in the book that I love. There's like a throwaway line in the beginning where Tyrion says that weddings are better than battles because people are less likely to cut off your nose. And it's like, cute. And in terms of like weird, dreamy foreshadowing that, you know, these books love to do, the Fool on Dragonstone, Stannis's Fool, sings about fool's blood, king's blood, blood on a maiden's thigh, but chains for the guests and chains for the bridegroom, I. So fool's blood is the fray that Catelyn slits his throat. King's blood, obviously Robb. Blood on the maiden's thigh because it's the wedding, and chains for the guests and chains for the groom. So like I love that. And like the first time you read that, you're like, this is meaningless. What am I doing? And we can get into. I mean, I can do a whole section on weird, trippy foreshadowing, as I pretty much have done every episode.
Foreshadowing corner.
Foreshadowing corner. But when Arya, in the 1 or 2 chapters where Arya meets that old woman with the red eyes and the white hair in the Riverlands, with her weird prophecies, you know, they're like, oh, she's a spooky old dwarf woman who like lives in a tree, and it's like, she's a child of the forest, guys, but okay. But she's got all these prophecies about a roaring river and a woman that was a fish rising from the dead. And it's, you know, all kinds of foreshadowing for that. And so that's what I keep digging out on my rereads in terms of Red Wedding, is just all the crazy stuff happening before it that, you know, paints the picture of it coming.
One of the things that has been the hardest for me just kind of getting through this is like reliving all of the tragedy. And we like harped on that when we were talking about Ned and his honor and his death, and just kind of seeing that replayed in Robb leading up to the Red Wedding and all of his like very stupid decisions and all of that. It's so bad.
I do appreciate, as much as like Catelyn was hard, I am glad we were seeing it at least through her eyes and not his. I don't think I could have taken it through to like watch him think through his terrible fucking decisions.
The only thing that is like bringing me along and that gives me hope, I remember having this moment in the show too, as like after Robb and Cat die, and that you're feeling very, especially maybe because I'm a Stark girl, like I was like, yay Starks, king in the north, like this is awesome. And then all of a sudden, like Ned's gone, Robb's gone, Cat's gone, you know, Bran is up north of the wall doing God knows what. So there was a moment of like, I don't know, feeling really sad because my favorites were like not doing well. And I remember seeing a meme, and I don't remember where or who or what, but I remember seeing a meme, and it was of like Bran as a warg and Jon in the Night's Watch, and then you know, just all the kids kind of listed, and it says kind of like, if you don't think the Starks stand a chance, like you haven't been paying attention, and kind of calling back to how this portion of the Stark family and this generation of them kind of build up from there. And, you know, Arya goes and becomes like this little murdering badass. And like we see Sansa's whole progression, and Bran's getting superpowers and all of this. So it kind of taught me to like hope in a new direction. But I just thought that hope was in Rob and in Ned and in Kat. So this moment of like having that kind of swept away is very difficult, but in my head I'm like, okay, but this is where, this is okay. Like we still got like things to come, and especially because we don't get any of what is she called, Lady Stoneheart, I guess, in the future of like we don't get any of that in the show, and I'm just like pumped to see. Even if it's just a little bit, I don't know what the magnitude of this is, but anything that we get from her, I'm like pumped.
All I want to do is talk about Lady Stoneheart. Yes. Let's do this. This may actually be the reason that I was like, everybody read these books with me, because the show leaves out things that I need to talk about. And Lady Stoneheart is like primo among them. Probably the most like, in the fandom, like the biggest betrayal that the show did to the fans was not including Lady Stoneheart, which like I get that it's hard to like, pay the actor to play Lady Cat when she like can't talk and just has to like be a weird dead body.
Yeah, basically all the magic that they subtracted from the show is like you get it from from like all of the things that go into producing a TV show. It makes totally perfect sense. But it is my favorite part of coming to the books now. Like that is the thing that I most get out of this, is all the magic.
Right. And so, I mean, I love everything about the Lady Stoneheart reveal. I love that it's Arya warging into her wolf who pulls her from the river. And I love that it's the Brotherhood without banners who she's with in the end. And she's just on this murdering Frey's vengeance tour. And it's the fucking coolest and awesome. And I love it. And I I am all about Lady Stoneheart. And I think, the show definitely, I feel like the show kind of took some of her story and just gave it to Arya in terms of like running around murdering Freys.
I was going to ask you about that too. I finished it and I was like, wait, so is that like a thing that we see is when Arya returns and kills Walder Frey? Like, was that a Lady Stoneheart thing?
I mean, that hasn't, Walder Frey is still alive I don't know. Now I don't want to spoil, but
that's sorry. Yes, we do have two more books. Okay.
But no, that murder scene hasn't happened yet in the published books. I think it could happen in the future, and I think it could be up for grabs whether it's Lady Stoneheart or Arya or Hope of all hopes, both, who make that happen. Just throwing that out into the world and hoping it comes back to me. So I'm curious, how much, if any, did you know about Lady Stoneheart going into reading this, just like as being around the fandom, even if you hadn't read the books yet? And how much was this like, oh, what the hell is happening?
No, I knew. So
yeah. Same.
Part of my experience with Game of Thrones, a TV show, and recapping it was that I spoiled the shit out of myself. Like, anytime I was like, oh no, Sansa, I love her, what's going to happen? Like, I would go on, like, the wiki of A Song of Ice and Fire and just make sure she was alive in the latest book. Things of that nature. So because of that, like, I was never specifically, like, reading full summaries or anything, but I would look up information, and I just gathered a ton of, like, this random stuff. So I knew that Lady Stoneheart was a thing. I don't know, like, after this point, I don't know anything else. Well, I guess I think I know one more thing about somebody that she kills. But other than that, like, I don't know what her plot is going to be or her progression or how much she's featured or any of that. So, I mean, that's a pretty big spoiler, but...
So yeah, same on all counts.
Cool. She's my fave.
Yeah, she's great. I am. We've dedicated a lot of time to talking about her, and she makes like half a second's appearance in this book. So I'm really excited for the next book when we get to really, for realsies, talk about her.
I will say, I love that. I mean, I love that chapter as an epilogue that you get Lady Stoneheart, and I love that the last chapter before that is Sansa in the Eyrie. I love that chapter so much. I think it sets up. I think it's like kind of like the pivotal moment in between child Sansa and teenage Sansa. Like, I think this is the chapter that she realizes all kinds of different things about the world and who wants what from her and what her role in it is and how she can be manipulated and manipulating others. I think all of that kind of starts to come together in that last chapter in this book. And then Littlefinger pushes Liza out the moon door, and you're like, what? And I swear that still somehow shocks me every time I read it. I think because I've made it so far in the book and so many of the big moments have already happened that I'm like, okay, we've got to be out of big moments by now. And then that happens. And I'm like, shit, that is still another big moment. But I just really enjoy that chapter and all that it kind of portends for Sansa's future and the cool ass stuff she's going to get to do in the books that the show does not do at all.
I think that there were a few moments throughout Sansa's chapters that I was really like, I see what you are doing, book. And just kind of getting to see her progression. There's one moment in particular that she's sitting with some of the Tyrells, some of the younger Tyrells, and they're laughing about a cute boy and Joffrey being cute. And she says at one point that she feels sorry for them because of how naive they are, but also she envies them in that. And just kind of seeing how much she's suffered and how much she's growing. And even reading about her after she got married to Tyrion on her wedding night and just kind of the brave face that she puts on it. She's trying to do her duty. Sansa always is trying to do her duty. And in the face of something, where she's married to this guy she doesn't want to be married to, and she has no idea what's happening, but she's taking off my clothes and, getting into bed. And you're just you precious baby. She's so brave. She's so strong. She's doing what she has to do to survive. And I'm so happy that comes across as well, if not better, in the books than it did in the show, because Sansa's arc is one of my favorite. Obviously, I've talked about it a lot, but I just love the way that you're seeing those bits and pieces of her character growth in the book as well.
Yeah, I am very excited to watch where her story goes. Honestly, less even from the perspective of because the show did something to me, this is the ultimate experience in bonus content. Mari and I have both talked about this as people who watched the Harry Potter movies before reading the books, that then the experience of the books was bonus content. And this to me is
sorry, my mind is blown that you guys watched the Harry Potter movies before reading the books.
All of them.
Oh
all
my
of them have been
God.
out.
Yep.
I am shook. Yep. Okay, I'm sorry. Continue.
Yep. This is a whole thing. But it's to me, because Sansa is my favorite, I'm so excited that I now get to have two whole entire separate Sansa arcs and storylines. To me, this is I mean, it's a little bittersweet because there's a part of me that's if they know what the big grand end game is, and whatever the fuck Sansa's about to do clearly didn't matter. That to there's a level on which I'm concerned, is that there's if we're trying to get to this destination, then I feel like everyone is doing Sansa dirty and not caring enough about her in the long run, and I'm nervous from that perspective. But that's just a loose, ambiguous anxiety. I'm mostly just very excited because I now get a brand new Sansa story.
And there are a couple things as I'm reading too that I'm really curious about, what endgame is going to be. It's just funny because we have so much story to go, specifically being in the third book, but also it being unfinished, the published books being unfinished, the show being unfinished. But I'm so curious about Endgame. I think it started for me when we were reading the prologue and we were in the head of one of these night watchmen, and it was disgusting. I hated I started the whole book on a very bad foot because being in his head for that prologue was awful. And he's thinking about not only betraying the Night's Watch and being a deserter, but there's some thoughts about the women he raped and how they deserved it and all of this stuff. But then also George R.R. Martin is trying to, I think, make him sympathetic in some ways because of, I don't know, it was just a very, very weird thing. So the entire time I'm thinking, it starts off on the foot where I'm thinking, what is George trying to tell me? What are
where are you going here, dude?
Right. We talk a lot about different things. honor is a big thing that we continue to talk about in this book, especially because of Jaime and him being the Kingslayer, and, you know, Brienne being on the opposite end of that and her being the oath keeper, basically. Like, she gives her word, and that's her word is her word, basically. So all of these different characters, and I'm wondering what his end message is going to be about, like, honor. And then on the other hand, I'm like, okay, the religion is obviously a very big thing, and the Lord of Light really comes into play here with all of the big things that he does and raising people from the dead, and Stannis is over there like with leeches and blood and the whole other thing, right? And I'm like, okay, but what will be the end game of the religion aspect of this, if even will be one, which I suspect there may not be, and I'm going to be disappointed. But I don't know, the way that my brain is like fast forwarding, because I want to know where we're headed.
One thing that I did enjoy, I guess, without knowing anything about where we're headed, because I suspect Sam is now trying to measure what words she can say in answer to this. But I, as far as the religious question is concerned, this is another thing that I really liked about Lady Stoneheart, just to bring her up again, is that to me felt like a clear indication that it's not just that the Lord of Light is legit and real. The dire wolves are clearly of the old gods, and like the fact that Nymeria is the one who drags her out of the river, I guess I don't know if this will be like confirmed or denied some other way, but that to me feels like the work of either the old gods or the Seven. Like, not, that doesn't feel like a Lord of Light thing to me? Question mark.
Sam, is there anything you can say?
There's some stuff I can say. Yes, I'm being like, just trying to be careful, and also like I don't even know like what's a spoiler and what's in my head at this point. I will say
spoiler or something I made up.
Spoiler or headcanon, to be determined. I will say that I guess the Lord of Light link to Lady Stoneheart is that. Oh, do you find this out later? Whatever. It's not that big a deal.
Well, she is with the Brotherhood Without Banners. That we know now.
So Beric the way Beric was reanimated by Thoros, the Red Priest, like kissing him and giving him like the whatever, like fire kiss, Lord of Light thing to make him come alive again. That's what Beric does to Catelyn.
Okay.
So there is some sort of Lord of Light thing in there, but I think the question of like, at least like from a fandom perspective and like what people think about religion in the series, it's like the Seven are not real and nobody gives a shit about the Seven. The old gods definitely have power, and we see it over and over and over again. And there's something to R'hllora as well, but maybe that's a lot more complicated than it seems. And so I personally come down on the side of like, yay, old gods. I have some thoughts about, kind of like you said, like, does a lot of stuff that looks like R'hllora did it actually have more to do with stuff that's connected to the old gods, like Nymeria? TBD, I guess. But I think that definitely is a debate within everybody, and I don't have that many answers to that. And yeah, probably we never will. It will just all be confused. But I will say that the amount of stuff you get in this book in terms of stuff happening north of the Wall, you know, Sam and Gilly get rescued by like a magical flock of ravens, and then also like go through a talking door, and like also have Cold Hands riding on a giant elk, and like so there's like a lot of stuff with that in terms of old god power. Jaime has that weird dream when he's sleeping on a weirwood. We have that old woman that I talked about before, who's like probably a child of the forest, who says all these weird prophetic things, but like some of them have already happened, so you kind of do, you know, trust that she's got some kind of power, because some of the metaphorical things she talks about sound like Stannis and Renly. Some of them sound like, you know, Red Wedding stuff. And my favorite thing that she says, she talks about a maid at a feast with purple serpents in her hair, dripping with venom, which is, you know, the headpiece Sansa wears to the Purple Wedding that has the poison in it. And they say that she sees the same maid later slaying a savage giant in a castle made of snow, which you think is going to be like, metaphorical, some, you don't understand what a metaphor that is. And then you see, her tearing apart little Robin's little toy giant in her Snow Winterfell castle in the last chapter. And that's one of my favorite things in the universe. And I would like that to be known. How did we get here? Religion? Okay.
Well, we're kind of on prophecy now, and we talked about this last episode, and so every time it happened I was very aware, but Dani had her whole romp of a prophecy in the last book, and she's so, and not only her, because Jorah brings it up too, but they're harping on it so much. They're like, I gotta get betrayed 2 more times. I need to be married maybe twice because of this whole 3-headed dragon thing. So the way that she keeps referencing it and framing her decisions and trying to figure out what's what is one of my favorite things, even though her whole, and it was true in the show as well, her whole tour through the cities and recapturing them is not my fave, but anytime she's the prophecy, I'm all for it.
Yeah. It's especially funny just because there are so many things where you see characters being dismissive of stuff like that, just across media, not here, just in general. And so watching her constantly checking back in, let me check my notes. Can I?
And it also
how many betrayals?
Right. It also is a sort of fun meta spin on okay, can you avoid a prophecy? Can you do it by paying not enough attention to it, by paying too much attention to it? How do you navigate that? And that we should revisit in the next book when we get to some Cersei stuff.
I mean, we're always game to revisit prophecies.
That's
and
all I ever want to do, truly.
I do have one other big nitpick that I wanna discuss. My other big grievance here. Murray mentioned it with the prologue and the way that the being in the dude's head and he's thinking about all the women he's raped and whatever. I had a lot of issues in the first, kind of from the beginning with some of the ways that George R. R. Martin talks about and describes Dany, and just a lot of things regarding sex and women. There are just a number of places that I'm this makes me kind of uncomfortable here and there. This book, I feel it finally got to a place where when I mentioned that I had to stop at points, there were 2 instances in particular where the word rape was mentioned in a way that I was I'm stopping in the middle of a sentence. I just need to set this down and walk away, because I just don't feel he is handling it well. I feel sexual assault is being handled in these books in a way that I find very upsetting. And it reminds me a little bit of how, I guess the season 5, I think, was the last season that I was recapping. And I remember that was when I finally stopped. And I remember we had this whole conversation in the recaps about how it didn't really matter what the show did at this point. It had built so much negative credit in terms of its handling of rape and sexual assault that I was just I just don't give a shit. I don't trust you. I don't trust you with this topic anymore. And that is how I felt about this book as well. I feel it just got to be a thing where it's just bandied about so fucking cavalierly and in ways that I find deeply frustrating for things that are bigger than George R. R. Martin himself. I'm not I don't mean to lay this all at his feet he is solely the problem here. But I think that this is a pervasive problem. Dudes trying to build deep, dark ass worlds and showing men visions of their lives that are radically removed from their daily lives, and then showing women things that they legitimately fear happening to them in their current day-to-day in certain ways. And I just that, I don't know. There are things about it, specifically the 2 points that made me stop, and I by themselves they're whatever, but it's taken in the larger context of the book, I couldn't fucking handle it. Jaime has this thought where he's yeah, Brienne is strong enough to handle getting raped a few times, and it's it's not grappled with in any way how fucking terrible that is. And then later, and this is also part of it, is that I would fume about it. This would happen. I would be very upset. And then whenever I was maybe getting to a place where I had started to get over it, something else sexual assault related would come up. And I was you didn't even give me enough time to stop being angry with you before you fucking did it again. And the maybe I don't know how many pages later, but not very long thereafter, there's a bit where Dany's thinking about how hot Dario is, and she's like, "Yeah, if ever there's a man who could rape you with his eyes." Like what even
That's
is
like
this?
literally one of my least favorite lines in the entire series. Not just because it's offensive, also because it's shitty writing. There are, and I don't want this to be a sidetrack because I want to get back to the main point. There are a bunch of times in this book and only this book where I'm like, usually George is the master of showing, not telling. Like, usually he is so good at painting a world and letting you come to a conclusion about what it means, rather than just saying, and then John felt like his heart was torn in two different places. We know that because we're reading the book.
I fucking get it. I've been in John's head for hundreds of pages.
Right, so that I think is one of those exact moments where it wasn't just problematic, it was also like we didn't need it. It was superfluous.
Yeah, it was bad writing in addition to being offensive.
And I think that they are interconnected because we're willing to forgive a lot of terrible stuff in service to a story, in service to characters, in service to a world. And so the more you put in a phrase like, "Oh, he could rape me with his eyes," that doesn't have any purpose. It's like we talked about before, you lose any goodwill you had by throwing in ones like that when something comes up that that should be in there because that's a complicated and horrible part of life and that's part of the story we're telling, but we trust you less to get that right when you have lines like, "Oh, Dario should rape me with his eyes," and also he has a blue tooth and a blue beard and a gold tooth. Wait, okay, I'm sorry, we need to talk a lot about I keep getting off track from the very important point that Nicole is trying to make, but it is also really important that we talk about how fucking hideous Dario is in the books.
It's true. That's true.
But getting back,
I remember when he was first came out on the TV show, people were upset about, I didn't know what about his appearance. I knew he had blue hair somewhere, but as I was reading his description in the book, I'm like, yeah, they changed that.
Obviously they didn't give him a blue forked beard and blue hair and a gold tooth. Fuck you, George.
Every time they describe him, I'm like, the show gave me a better image. I'm not engaging with this at all. I will not be visualizing this man.
So yeah, I will say that were these books very obviously written by, an older white straight male fantasy writer in the 90s? Yes. And so a lot of shit comes with that. That either reads differently today than it would have then, that either always was bad and shouldn't have been in there, or that we've been inundated with a lot of stories with a lot of epic violence in them, and they're just, there's a certain point where you just don't want to fucking read it anymore. And I think all of those are valid, and any reaction to these books that involves that, that perspective is 1,000% valid.
I think it's especially highlighted here in this book and in this world because even with quote unquote strong female characters and women who are at the forefront of the story and who you have hopes for doing great things or whatnot, women in this world are not treated very well, and we see that a lot. In this book specifically, we revisit Cersei being under her father's thumb still, and he's trying to marry her off again, and her reaction of no, I am not doing that again, and the way that Sansa's married off, and all of this talk of who's getting whose daughter and marrying into this family and all of these alliances through marriage or whatnot. So we see that featured very heavily here, and so that entire idea of consent is very present as you're reading this, and I think that he doesn't do a great job. There's another Dany line where she's thinking about this, about being I don't remember in what context, but she's saying to somebody else or thinking that she got sold off in marriage too, and nobody consulted her about it, and then she's like, but that worked out well. And I'm just still rape. It was still rape. So it was a lot of different instances that it just made me feel pretty icky as well. And I just don't want it. There was a lot, he throws in sex in weird places and areas just like peppered in, like here's more talk about somebody's cock or somebody getting hard at an inopportune moment, and I'm just like, George, come on, why do we leave
it? Can I talk about the most sex positive dad in this entire story, and that is a man by the name of Tormund Giantsbane. Because there is a throwaway line about his daughter getting, I use the word married, but the wildlings probably would use that word. But the guy who steals her away is named Long Spear Rick, and he does not fight with a spear. And he is thrilled for his daughter, having married someone with big dick energy. And I think that is so phenomenal. And is maybe my favorite thing in the world. And I just want to give a shout out to Tormund, Father of the Year, truly supportive of his daughter and her happiness in every way imaginable.
This is a good little segue to my not as serious, because the whole rapey thing is awful, but my nitpick with George and his writing style is the dialogue. And I think a lot of that repetition that we talked about earlier comes through his dialogue that sometimes is a little wooden and unnatural for me. And that to me was highlighted in this book in Ygritte, whatever her name is. John. I didn't like her in the show, and I did not like her in the book. And if I had to hear "you know nothing" one more time out of that girl's mouth, I was just like ready to like, and it was like multiple times in the same chapter. It was like every other thing she said, and I was just like, we get it. Like he's not good with dialogue. Not always, but just in that like repetition and just like, get it? It's a catchphrase, and we're like, yes,
yep,
we get it.
Yeah. I think this actually sort of comes back around to kind of like the sort of mixed feelings that I have about these books so far. I think it's probably safe to say that I'm enjoying them, but I seem to be enjoying them least of the three of us. And I think that what George R. R. Martin is very effective at is like constructing a very, very elaborate puzzle. Like there's just so many intricate little pieces, and like that is the thing that he has done very, very well, like constructing all of like the pieces of that. But I think that like there are just a ton of examples throughout where like the writing is often found wanting, and like that for me has been a huge struggle. And so like watching him, so there are certain pieces of the puzzle that are like, a lot of the like world building pieces or whatever, like things that are less relevant to like the plot advancement pieces, which is what I am most interested in, like plot or, character study stuff. Anytime he's not doing either one of those two things, I'm like, I can't, I don't want it. Like, I'm not interested. Like, your writing is not good enough for me to care about you, like doing more of these other pieces. And so I think like that is a lot of where and why I end up struggling with it at times, even though I don't want to suggest that I hate these books or anything, because that's not what I'm saying. But I think it's just, it's been a little bit of a struggle at times.
Yeah. And I think that this book has, it definitely has some of my least favorite writing and stuff that we've talked about already. It does have one or two of my favorite chapters that I would like to give a shout out to. Sam's chapter, where we find out what happened at the Fist of the First Men, and his, them fleeing, and the sobbing Sam took another step repetition, which I think is one of the rare times when George uses repetition as a strength.
The repetition serves a legitimate purpose.
Extremely effective purpose. Every time, like I could read that chapter 1,000 times and never get sick of it. It's, I think, a work of art in and of itself. I think the way we piece together the story of what happened by Sam writing out all the letters to send, for the birds to send as he hears the battle happening around him. And as the battle gets closer and closer to him, you can hear him giving up and admitting that they've lost. And I love that chapter so freaking much. And I think that, there's a way to use repetition like in a truncated space in a single chapter that just keeps tugging at your heartstrings, as opposed to just saying the same shit over and over again over the series of a book and a half, and we're like, we get it. I think the biggest offender of that in the next 2 books is going to be the phrase "words are wind," which will come up so many times you will lose your mind. And George even admitted that his editor tried to make him take out like half of them, and he was like, no, because he's the worst. So like, I can admit that is, you know, terrible. So yeah, get ready for words are wind.
Words are wind.
I swear, game? We will die if we do that drinking game. That is real.
Noted. Okay.
I do want to talk about one more tiny foreshadowing, just because this was one I never caught until this read of the books. There's a Davos chapter where he's talking about the stars and the constellations, and one of them is called the Ice Dragon, and he talks about the Ice Dragon's bright blue eye marking north. That's exactly the noise I made, guys. I was like, it's on the show. And so that's why I've never caught that before, because this is my first reread since watching an ice dragon on the show. But so in case we were worried that the books would not include an ice dragon, which like none of us were, but
clearly,
but like
clearly.
hard foreshadowing evidence for an ice dragon with a bright blue eye. And I think John talks about ice dragons a lot. Just as like a metaphor for like he'll like walk down like part of the wall and he'll like feel like he's stepping into the mouth of an ice dragon or something. So you do get those shout outs a lot. But I just thought specifically it as a constellation with the bright blue eye marking north was like awesome. And that it showed up in a Davos chapter where like you're not looking for signs of like in a John chapter you might be looking for something like that. In a Danny chapter even, but Davos, like it's a surprise to find that there. And that was a super fun little Easter egg for me on this read.
Having complained about some stuff, I do also want to mention something that I legitimately loved. And like, this isn't something that is new in this book. It has happened, you know, throughout the books up to this point. It stood out to me more with the Lannisters this time. And I think that was sort of thing, like it's something that we had seen a little bit with the Starks and now also seeing it, like, I don't know. But there's this David Foster Wallace quote about like, how, you know, we all sort of like worship something and like the thing that you worship can like be your undoing in a way. And it was interesting to see, I guess, parallels almost between how Tywin's like quest for his family legacy is basically like he keeps making all of these choices that make it so that he will not have one, in kind of the same way that, you know, Ned's like quest for honor and also his family like is actually the undoing of his family in certain ways. And I don't know, I thought that was really, really interesting. And there are a ton of characters. Almost everybody has sort of something kind of like central like that like something that is like a deeply held thing that they can't seem to really like let go of or compromise on, and like they suffer for it again. I mean, Sansa and her like, you know, life is a song, and like her refusal to let go of that just like continues to create heartbreak for her time and time again. I could go on. There's like a lot of examples of this, and I just, that stood out to me a lot more in this book, even though I think like it's been there all along.
Yeah, I love that, particularly in the context of Tywin and the Lannisters, and, you know, Tywin being focused on family and legacy all at once is the destruction of his family. I think even from the simplicity of like, you raised your children to believe that only Lannisters are good, so of course your children are gonna fuck each other. You literally raised them to believe everyone else is trash and they're amazing. So like, obviously this is going to happen.
Yup.
And so I love that like they probably could have avoided all of that if Tywin could just admit like, yeah, other people are all right too. And you know, obviously that ends up, you know, only becoming even more true with like, you know, trying to preserve whatever part of his legacy he thought he could by putting his son on trial and executing him for, you know, murder. And again, that didn't turn out quite like he wanted either. I will say, and like we like don't even have time to get into this as its own topic, but I think this is the book where I start feeling like Tyrion is a villain who nobody realizes is the villain yet. And I think that becomes more true and more obvious in future plot lines with him. But there's a few different things he says that once you've read them again and again and again, you're like, what? He has this quote about, so he's hiding Shay, his prostitute / girlfriend, because he knows his father would kill her if he caught her. So he pretends to be seeing this other prostitute, Alayaya, which is impossible to say, but whatever. So Alayaya ends up getting, picked up by Cersei's people and whipped and scourged or whatever because they think that that's Tyrion's girlfriend. And Tyrion has like a thought of like, she was just a veil to hide Shay. It never even occurred to me that like she would be in danger. Okay,
right.
but you had to hide Shay because your father wanted to kill her. So the girl hiding that girl, is in some fucking danger, buddy. And, I think maybe in the last book, there's one where he was like, oh, like I should have sent Sansa away before the Battle of the Blackwater. It didn't even occur to me to do that. Like, and so in the guise of him sounding concerned, you actually realize, like, no, a good person would have thought of this a year ago, not after the woman has been scourged, which he then goes on to say, well, I guess I have to scourge my 8-year-old nephew now too, because otherwise my sister will win. And it's like, do you hear yourself, buddy? Like, what? And then, like, he goes on what I think is extremely justified killing spree of his father, and then a ridiculously unjustified killing spree of Shay.
Yeah, the show makes it feel more justified.
So the show very specifically and very over-the-toply makes that Tyrion self-defense. Shay grabs a knife and tries to kill him, and then he reacts in the show. In the books, he fucking strangles her with his bare hands. Like that, she's laying in bed waiting for his father.
And it's not clear in the book how and when she turned. Like her turning on Tyrion.
Right. In the books, it's really that Tyrion wants to believe there's something real there, and so he ignores every single red flag about her, which is that she sure talks about gold and gems and silks a lot for somebody who's just here because she loves you. And remember, you're paying her. So, do I think there could have been justification in terms of, she did like seal the deal in terms of his trial and the lies she said about him must have fucking broken him? Yes. But I don't think that's why he killed her. I think he killed her for sleeping with his father. And that's not justifiable on his end.
I find all of this fascinating. I did not think any of these thoughts really while reading it, but I mentioned earlier that there were like a longer list of characters whose heads I didn't really want to be in this book, and Tyrion was also on that list. I mentioned Jaime, but basically Arya, Sansa, Dany, and Davos and Jon too, I guess. Davos and Jon, yeah, that's it. Those are the brains I wanted to be in. Everyone else, I was like, all right.
But I just think it's so interesting that so much of the conversation revolves around whether Jaime is a good guy or a bad guy. I mean, I think the conversation itself ignores the entire point of the book, which is that everybody is gray. There's even an example in this book where Melisandre talks about, if half an onion is black with rot, it's a rotten onion. And then I think even in a different chapter, Davos literally he's eating an onion and he cuts out the raw part and eats the good part. Because an onion with some rot in it isn't useless. You cut out the bad and you have the good. And so it's always kind of mystified me that so much of the conversation is about who's a good guy and who's a bad guy, when like Jaime has done horrible, disgusting, undefendable things, and he has saved like hundreds of thousands of lives. And both of those things are true, and neither one necessarily takes anything away from the other. And I find it so interesting that we all talk about that in the context of Jaime, when like Tyrion we just accept as a hero, when I think he does some of the most fucked up shit in this entire series. And because he's downtrodden and because he's an audience stand-in for a lot of like our intellectual perspective into the story, we feel his emotions, we feel him as a stand-in for us. He doesn't get let off the hook in world, but he gets let off the hook by the audience for like every horrible thing he does.
I a little bit feel like, in terms of being let off the hook in world, I feel a little bit like the book kind of takes the perspective that we should look down on Sansa for her vanity, but we shouldn't be looking down on Tyrion for his, like being sort of shallow and superficial in kind of the ways that they think about each other. And that bothers me a little bit. Like, there are just certain things about the way in which them thinking about each other is framed. I think the in-world, he gets a little bit, not in-world by the characters, but by like the book itself, the book perspective is letting him off a little bit. I mean, in-world, everybody hates him.
But I think but by
book,
treatment by the author,
perspective.
I'll say let's also revisit that in the next 2 episodes, because there's a lot more.
Okay.
I think he starts to be held more accountable by George in the next book. But I still don't know if the fandom really knows that or not. And again, I talk about the fandom like it's one thing and like I'm the spokesman for it, neither of which are true at all.
Well, you're the only one we're talking to, so you are indeed our spokesman for
Basically,
the
my
fandom.
credentials are I listen to a lot of other podcasts that also talk about that.
I just want to, again, this is one of those things we won't have time to really get into, but since we were talking about Tyrion and the way that Sansa sees him and he and vice versa or whatnot, one of the things that George does, and I don't think he does particularly well, is look at disability and grapple with that and the shorthand he has for giving people disabilities and what that means within story and what it represents, and like something bad has got to happen. Well, it's either a rape or somebody's losing a limb kind of thing.
Right.
And it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that the story, for the most part, shows you that these people who are making fun of Tyrion and looking down on him are wrong. But there are some times where I don't think that that's clear. And even just the way that he uses it in the story makes me incredibly uncomfortable. So it's one of those things like the, sexual assault that, to all of, Sam's earlier points, you can very clearly see that this was written by a straight white man in the 90s. Yes, all of that. Absolutely. You kind of understand that, but it doesn't make it any more comfortable to read as a present day reader.
Agreed.
My one thing that my theme that stood out to me, like maybe this is my vote for what the thesis of this of this book is.
Jesus, we're over an hour in.
I know. But the one that stood out to me very quickly is this whole idea of how battles are won. And I think we get it from different perspectives because Rob, everyone around him says it a few times, but he keeps winning battles, but he's not winning anything else. He's like losing on every other playing field that there is. And Tywin has this line where he tells Tyrion that some battles are won with ravens and quills or something of that nature. Like there's some negotiating that you have to do to win battles. And meanwhile, across the sea, you have Dany acquiring this massive army. And so this entire idea of how are battles won is it, and then north of the wall, the wildlings have all of this courage and, they're wild and all of that. And, Jon is repeatedly saying, no, but discipline wins wars. So there's all of this discourse happening about what is going to eventually win this war. Is it numbers? Is it, courage? Is it discipline? Is it strategy? Is it the Littlefinger route of manipulating behind the scenes? And Tyrion is, the only one that is is anyone watching Littlefinger at all? He's just over here getting away with it. And everybody's have Harrenhal. Why don't you go marry Lysa and get the veil too?
I will say there's one thing, again, that I didn't notice until this reread that I had highlighted. And that's when Littlefinger is like, oh, I know. Why don't I go try and marry Lysa Arryn? Because that'd be awesome for me. The High Septon is like, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. And it's just wait, who the fuck are you? Why didn't I realize that you are clearly paid by Littlefinger to agree with him in small council meetings? Who is this guy?
Yeah, this will be, I think, one of those things that we'll see if we get to see Endgame. When it's going to say a lot at the end of the day to see who wins, because I think that will inform this idea of how battles are won and how that person won the Game of Thrones at the end of the day. So
I think it's going to be the Ice Dragon. Something tells me.
Ice Dragon 2019.
Ice Dragon 2K19 for the win.
And on that note, we've reached the end of another episode. Thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. We really appreciate everybody who has taken the time to share, to subscribe, to rate, and to review. We have received questions on how you can continue to support Snark Squad Pod, and we are super excited to announce that we've officially launched our Patreon. That's at patreon.com/SnarkSquad, and there you can find all of our tiers and perks, which include bonus content. Our experience in podcasting has been truly amazing, and this just makes sure that we can cover the cost of equipment and hosting, and that we can continue to grow. For anybody who is willing and able, we'd really appreciate if you would check out patreon.com/SnarkSquad. Thank you so much to Sam, as always, for being so delightful and our queen of foreshadowing. Thank you guys for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and rating and reviewing on iTunes. And of course, we'd love to hear all of your thoughts on A Storm of Swords. There will be a post dedicated to this episode on SnarkSquad.com, and that is also the best place to check out what we are covering in the future. You can also find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. I am at My Name is Marines.
You can find me at Sweeney Says.
And you can find me at Democracy Diva.
Thank you to Stefan Chin, as always, for our delightful theme music, and we will be back in your ears next week. Bye.
Bye.